Hi, my name is Brian, and I'm the High Pop Professor. And today, I'd like to talk about something that's kind of an interesting topic that was brought up last month in an online post on Facebook. And I've been sort of thinking about it, mulling it over, and I wanted to do a video about it because I thought A, it was interesting, and I thought B, that it provides a learning opportunity for us. And I'm kind of all about that. So today, I want to discuss power rankings of 90s players, and specifically how it refers to their hobby values in relation to each other. So it's important to realize that something like ranking a list of players, something like this, it's going to be controversial because you're there's an element of the objective. It's true. No one's going to argue with you. I think that Griffey sells for more than anybody else in the 90s. So yeah, we can put him on top, and you would be just wrong to put anyone else above him. Okay. Well, except for one exception that we'll get to later. But how does everybody else stack up? And even then, even if you generally have it right, you're always going to find specific examples that will fall outside of that region. So that being said, it's important to distinguish and sort of define what we're talking about as far as power rankings. What do I mean by that phrase? And so, my brother Iconic Al, one of the main focuses, the primary basis of his channel was walking through a top 100 countdown list of the greatest and most iconic baseball players of all time. That is his definition. This power ranking is a little bit different. I'm thinking along the lines of more specifically hobby relevance and how that hierarchy, where they stack up on the totem pole, right? And so it's a useful thing to be able to have this sort of idea of ranking of where the players fall in line for a couple of reasons. A lot of times, if you're looking in either for very obscure sets, very low print run, hard to find cards, you can't always get good valid comps. You might look it up on 130 point. Maybe the last sale was before the pandemic, and so all those values are all irrelevant anyway. It's a different ball game. And so what are you going to do? How are you going to find these comp values for a card you're looking for? And so these power rankings can be really useful because if you find other players that are really close to the region that your main, for me it's Greg Maddux. If I find other players that sell for a really similar price that Maddux cards tend to sell for, I can use those as sort of a proxy comp. And so that works for me. And so that helps me sort of figure out and not either overpay for cards or just put a solid, a reasonable value of what to expect that would be, valued at. So I want to go ahead and go through a couple of the lists that were there. There were a couple of big posters on this Facebook page, and there was a primary list that was posted, and then there were some revisions made to that by another poster where a lot of the original positions of players were still intact with a few modifications. And so I just kind of wanted to talk through their lists a little bit and react to it. And then I wanted to walk through a couple examples of where it's really difficult to find accurate comp values for some of these cards, but by using proxy comps, we can sort of help to navigate where these players should stack up, and we can help to sort of figure out and narrow down a more precise window of what a reasonable value, comp value for some of these tougher to find and tougher to put a price tag on cards, what that kind of a number might be. So we're going to turn the camera around. We will look at some cards, but we'll also look at those lists and hear some commentary about just my thoughts regarding that. And also I wonder at the end of the video, I do wonder about this idea regarding power rankings and how that might apply to other eras. Certainly for ultramodern, where do guys like, Ronald Acuna and Bryce Harper, where do they stack up with a Juan Soto or an Ohtani or Aaron Judge or other guys? And so there certainly is the same kind of hierarchy. What about golden era? How does Yogi Berra stack up against Sandy Koufax, right? So anyway, we'll go ahead and turn the camera around. We'll look at some of these lists, discuss them, and then we'll talk about finding some comps by using these lists to help us. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the very first list that was posted on April 17th. And here it is. And again, this list is just specifically with hobby values. This has nothing whatsoever to do with players' careers or their war totals or anything like that. It just aims to sort of rank in a given set who gets the most value, where all these players lie in relation to each other, and the respective distances between those values is represented here too, which is a valuable thing to know. So let's start at the top here. And so we have Griffey at 100. And then coming down from there, we have our second tier of Bonds and Jeter. And they're at a 65. Frank Thomas is ranked at a 55. Ripken at 50. Maddox and Will Clark at 45. McGwire and Chipper at 40. Gwynn, Pedro, Sandberg, Larkin, and Nomo at 35. We got A-Rod, Mariano, Jose Canseco at 30. And then we got Wangon, Big Unit, Ricky Henderson, Ozzie Smith at 25. We got Vlad and Kirby Puckett at 20. Then we got Pudge Rodriguez, Larry Walker, Mike Piazza, Manny Ramirez at 15. Clemens, Edgar, Biggio, Sosa, Grace, Rowland, and Sheffield at 10. And last at 5, we have all the other stars that weren't mentioned: Bagwell, Glavine, Tomei, Smoltz, Palmeiro, Schilling, Lofton, Hoffman, Wagner, Wood, Salmon, Erstad, Bell, Ventura, Helton, Buhner, Greer, all that kind of stuff, etc., etc. And of course, this is not exhaustive. There are plenty of players I did not mention that were not even on this list, but still have high relevance. And so the idea is, where do those players fit in? So as I'm looking at this now, I will say my eyes tended to linger toward the upper end of this list, particularly about where, down to Maddox and a little bit above and a little bit below. Obviously, he's my guy. I feel like I know his market pretty well. And there were a couple things that jumped off at me. First, looking at the very top of the list, Griffey, really can't argue with that one. Bonds and Jeter, yeah. And surprisingly, I'm looking at that 65 number. Seems like a rather arbitrary value for where to put them. And I kind of like it. I think that's about right. That feels right to me. Frank Thomas at 55 is decidedly above everyone else who comes next. And I really like what I see here with a lot of these guys lumped around Maddox, because I agree. Next is, Ripken, Maddox, Chipper, and McGwire. They are all very close in other insert sets too, which we'll look at in a second. The one that sort of jumped out to me first, though, was Will Clark. This name, I don't know, this ranking of him at 45, even with Maddox, that doesn't seem right to me. I think Maddox is decidedly higher than Will Clark. I'm not saying that Will Clark doesn't have cards that sell for a lot. He certainly does. I just feel like the market is a little bit less consistent for him, but there can be still gigantic sales. And so just for a quick comparison, I did want to bring a few of these cards out here. Here's a beautiful 98 Donruss Crusade green. And this is one of my very favorite insert sets of all time, with this beautiful holofoil finish. It was a stealth insert that was inserted into various Donruss products. And it's just awesome. Amazing etching, amazing shine. The greens were numbered out of 250, the purples out of 100, and the reds out of 25. And the reason I pull this one out is because, well, there's, there are a couple of these that have sold, both in PSA 9s and ungraded. And so ungraded, this Maddox, probably about a $150 card, something like that. And a PSA 9 just sold recently for about $230, $235, something around there. And there was a Will Clark ungraded one that an auction just ended, a listing ended, and the opening bid was for $80, and it didn't get any bidders. Now, since it has been relisted, it's currently a live auction, it does now have a single bid for the opening $80 asking price. but I don't really expect that to get higher than 100. And so I understand this is just, one one card from one set and one comparison, but I do like to try to show my work. And so I think that Will Clark, the point is, I think he's a little too high on here. When it comes to, and also I noticed that Maddux was also above Gwynn, but not like really far above Gwynn. This list has Maddux at 45, Gwynn at 35. And, I do find, not all the time, there are exceptions, of course, I do find that Maddux tends to be a little bit more valued than Gwynn in the same set. I find in general, a lot of times Gwynn is about 80% of the value of whatever Maddux is. Now, again, this is a very rough generalization. This is by no means a hard and fast rule. Hey, in some sets, Gwynn is actually valued more above Maddux. But just I find that most of the time that's not the case. And so looking at these other ones, now some people might be surprised looking at some of these to see guys like Larkin or Nomo or Ozzy as high as they are, Canseco especially too. But I would remind you that there's a couple unusual anomalies happening with a list like this. One of them is that some of these guys that were gigantic stars in the 80s, well, they didn't have really rare, crazy parallels, low serial numbered stuff. They didn't have a lot of that in the 80s when they were big stars. But, some of them still had, playing days issues of cards that were very tough. Ozzie Smith, for example, great example of a guy to look at here. He does not have a PMG from 98 or 99. He doesn't have one. He doesn't have Adonis Crusade. He doesn't have a Precious Metals card from Donner's Preferred, like this one. And we'll look at this again in a second. But what Ozzy does have, he has 96 Select Certified Mirror Reds, Blues, and Golds. And again, those Mirror Golds, they were not serial numbered, but print runs of, for the red, blue, and gold of 90, 45, and 30 respectively. I think the idea here is that when you have players that have fewer of these really, premium, high-end inserts, all the collectors of that guy, they have fewer cards of them to go around. And so I think it creates a higher demand and therefore a higher price than a lot of us would probably realize, especially for guys like Canseco. Heck, there was speaking of Canseco, I believe there was a 97 Pinnacle totally certified platinum gold numbered out of 30 on the back that had sold fairly recently for like a couple months ago. And if you had asked me what I thought that card would sell for, I'd probably say about between $1,000 and $1,500. And this thing on auction, it sold for about $7,000. So I was just completely off. I definitely didn't have any clue about what that market was. That shocked me to see that go that high. But again, I think it speaks to the same sort of phenomenon. Anyway, and that applies for other guys too. Guys like Ricky Henderson, Canseco, Sandberg, and we'll get to another really big one, Nolan Ryan. We'll talk more about him later too. And then going down the list, most of this list feels right to me. The three that I think that need to be moved, though, like I said, Will Clark is too high on this list. Clemens at 10, I think, is too low. And the other one that jumped out at me was Bagwell at 5, is horrendously low. And that needs to move up. He needs to move up to where probably Vlad Puckett, he needs to move up to that range, in my opinion. So that was my take on this list. And then another person had responded and had made a few changes to that list. And this was their ranking. And they had, again, many of them were unchanged, but we had a couple, notable differences here. Still keeping Griffey at 100, still keeping Bonds and Jeter at 65. And then at 55, we have Frank Thomas, Chipper Jones, and Tony Gwynn. Interesting. At 45, we've got Maddux, Big Unit, Ripken, and Ozzy. At 40, we've got Puckett, McGuire, Sandberg, Larkin. 35, Pedro, Canseco, and Clemens. At 30, we got A-Rod, Mariano, Clark, Wangan, Nomo. 25, we got Vlad and Piazza. 20, we have Tommy and Sosa. At 15, Pudge, Walker, Manny, Mattingly, Nomar, Bagwell, Andrew Jones. And then at 10, Doc Gooden, Craig Biggio, Edgar, Martinez, Scott Rowland, Paul Molitor, Gary Sheffield, Grace, Glavin, Smoltz, Hoffman, Palmeiro, Schilling, Lofton, Wagner, Wood, Salmon, Nerstead, Bell, Eddie Murray, Helton, McGriff, yada, 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 so on and so forth. So again, this list, I like it a little bit better, and it made some of the same moves I would have made. However, they actually put Gwynn above Maddux, which I think is interesting. There are definitely some sets where that does happen. I think particularly sets like autograph ones. I think just the fact that, you know, Gwynn is no longer around to sign autographs, I think that does something to his market a little bit. But again, you know, it's still pretty close to see you know, Chipper, Ripken, Maddux, all around the same close, you know, tier, which I think is correct. Now, that being said, I do think that Frank Thomas is decidedly higher than Chipper, and I do think that Chipper is decidedly higher than Gwynn. So I might alter that about this list, but really, you know, and when it comes to guys like Sandberg and Larkin, and I just don't really have a good sense of what those markets are like. And so I really would just decline to comment on this and just say, look, this is what some very big collectors have noticed, have experienced. This is their opinion, how they feel about it. And I don't really have any grounds for argument here. So, you know, I'm by and large not really going to comment on this. But what I would like to say is, moving forward, I do want to add one more piece of data in here. And let's go ahead and align and see how this works. Last December, this entire set, this precious metal set from 97 Donruss Preferred, the entire set, PSA graded, came for auction at the exact same time. And so that was really great because it allowed us to really get a sense of where these players fall. We don't have to worry about the time difference, about, oh, well, that was months and months ago, and since then the market has done this, and since then the market's done that. And no, these were all listed on the same day, and they all ended within hours of each other. And most of them were PSA 8s and 9s. There were no 10s that would do crazy value things. And I think there was one 5. The Andrew Jones was a 5, so that'll be a low outlier. But everything else was pretty much 8s and 9s. You're not going to see that big of a difference there, I think, between 8s and 9s, especially with cards that are as rare as these, that are not serial numbered, but do have a print run of 100. So let's go ahead and put those on there and sort of compare and see what we see. So here were the sales prices for these cards. So the Griffey sold for about $1,300 at the very top here. The Jeter sold for $832, Bonds for $661. So there's a bit of a difference there in this particular case with Jeter and Bonds. I will say that Jeter and Bonds kind of can jockey back and forth between which one finishes a little bit higher than the other. But I don't really have a sense that one will consistently overvalue the other one. And so really, I still believe it's pretty fair to keep them both at the same value tier. Here we have Frank Thomas finishing at $555. Again, decidedly above everybody else. Vlad finishing at $521. That is a surprise finish. And that is one that I wouldn't have been able to predict, but this is what happened. Then we have Maddux at $470, Ripken at $465, McGuire at $441, and Chipper at $435. All pretty darn close, between $435 and $470, very close to each other. Any given day, Ripken could have finished higher than Maddux, and you know, Chipper could have also finished right up there too. So that's nothing too shocking there. Gwynn at $370. Again, there it is, where the Gwynn is finishing just at about 75% of what the Maddux did. That feels about right to me. Then we got Pudge and Piazza and A-Rod going down to $299. Bagwell up here at $281, and that I feel vindicated there, because the Bagwell, yeah, he should be around that A-Rod Piazza tier. Juan Gonzalez at 224, and then down from there we have some of the lower tier players, with the exception of Andrew Jones, which again was the PSA 5, and so I would put Andrew Jones up there, approaching that sort of A-Rod Bagwell tier as well. All right, so that being said, most of this particular sale, this particular example of this preferred precious metal set that has the 1 gram of actual platinum or silver or gold baked into this card, yeah, this is the one that was made in Japan by the Mitsubishi Company, and if you can see it right there, yeah, assayed and manufactured in Japan by Mitsubishi Materials Corporation. Look at that. So, my favorite Japanese card that I own. Well, my only Japanese card that I own. But here we go. And by the way, this was really just a partial parallel of one of the base cards in here. Here's a platinum cut to the chase, which is also a pretty tough card to get, although it wasn't serial numbered. There's the focus. Beautiful foil with the die cut. But yeah, same image. But this one's tougher to get than the base card, but this one's quite a bit tougher still. So those are fun to do. Okay, so seeing as how we have these cards to look at, let's go ahead and swap them out with a few others to sort of help us glean some data here. So here's a card that I picked up at the Philly show in December, and this is a Fleer Tradition Date with Destiny. I just sent it to PSA pretty recently to get this is an amazing card with amazing shine, crazy embossing on the face. We have this amazing hollow foil. We have a die cut. It's serial numbered out of 100, 99, Fleer Tradition, Date with Destiny. Just a fantastic card. Lovely card. And I did a partial cash, partial trade deal to get this. I made a whole video about it. So you can go ahead and check that out if you want to see. But bottom line was, the dealer that I ended up acquiring this card from had this in a one-touch. And the price tag he had listed on there was $375. Now, keep in mind, there's some chipping, on the edges of these cards. There always is. So most of them don't end up being graded. But how fair, how accurate is that $375 number? Well, again, based on the power rankings that we've just talked about and discussed, and let's take a look at some other completed listings, completed sales for cards in this set. So there isn't a sale of a Maddox from this set. You're not going to find one on eBay. I checked 130 point. I didn't even see one there. But here are some sales. And if we look at these sales, we're going to see some very interesting things. The numbers aren't even all that different than what they were for the preferred precious metals. We see what the Griffey is selling for. It's over 1,000. We can see what the Barry Bonds is selling for. We even have a Frank Thomas to take a look at here. And then we also have some other sales to look at. And notably, the sales that I'm talking about are the ones that jump off the page at me right there, are notably the A-Rod. That one is the one, because again, he's sort of a lower tier on this power rankings, but his card still sold for $375, which again, based on where Maddox is located on this power rankings tier, he should be higher valued than that. And so when you look to see something like that, that gives us a pretty good indication that that price of $375 that was on this card, probably a really good, probably more than fair price. Probably a really good price, actually. We hardly ever think of it in terms like that, but again, when we don't have good comp data, good sales data for a specific player in a specific set, I think power rankings is a great way to at least get really close and to not get burned. All right, and so one last example I'd like to take a look at, and I want to look at this example because there is something fairly significant, a significant sale, and I want to talk about a set that's a very important set to the hobby, and of course, I'm talking about the 93 finest refractors. So here's my example. Here's my copy of my Greg Maddux 93 Finest Refractor. And I want to talk about this set for a couple of reasons. I know a lot has been said about this set. It's one of the most important sets in hobby history. And this is my Grail card from the tail end of 2023, and was happily able to acquire this one just as I was moving to Philly, actually. So what is there to be said about this set? Well, a couple things are significant here. Number one, I mentioned before a little guy by the name of Nolan Ryan. So Nolan Ryan is the one guy who, in this set anyway, puts Griffey to shame. Nolan Ryan is far and away the most expensive card in this set, and I think it's kind of that same idea where with these star players from, in his case, the 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, this was still a playing days refractor. This is his only playing days refractor for Nolan Ryan. And so he doesn't have any, you know, PMGs, or he doesn't have any Select Certified Mirror Golds. No. If you're looking for 90s insert high-end, or in this case, parallel high-end, this is it. 93 Finest Refractor for Nolan Ryan. That's it. So in this power rankings for this set anyway, you know, if Griffey is 100, maybe Nolan Ryan's 120. You know, who knows? But that was one interesting anomaly I wanted to discuss. The other thing, though, involves a very recent pickup that I'm very excited about, and I can't wait to showcase. And that is that there is a card, a PSA 9 of this Greg Maddux 93 Finest Refractor, recently sold for $1,400. And, you know, looking at these power rankings and all these things like this, it got me thinking, and I was noticing a little bit of an anomaly. I saw another player there that was, I thought, grossly undervalued based on what I saw the power rankings was. So even if you would take that 1,400 sale and think maybe that's a little bit high, maybe it should be closer to 1,200. Okay, well, where would you put a value for a guy like Tony Gwynn? Tough to say. Some sets, remember, Gwynn sells for more than Maddux. In fact, one of the guys put Gwynn above Maddux in the power rankings. But is a Gwynn PSA 9 selling for $1,400 or $1,600 or even $1,000? No. Again, I said it before, my take is that Gwynn's about 75 or 80% of what Maddux is. But again, if Maddux were 1,000, 75 to 80% would be 750 to 800. If it's 1,200, then it's probably closer to 900 for 75%. So imagine my shock when it turns out for about $450 or $500, you can acquire a Tony Gwynn PSA 9 93 Finest Refractor. So very proud, very happy to showcase this brand new pickup of mine. Really pumped about it. But just complete, you know, this again just seems like it's a complete anomaly. I don't understand why Gwynn has that much of a lower value than Maddux when, by all, you know, by all rights, with how the power rankings work, this should be like a $800 card, but somehow it's not. I don't know. I think that, you know, it just feels like it's undervalued for what it is. So really stoked, really pumped to get this card and add this to my Tony Gwynn PC, add this to my collection. I'm actually almost finished. I feel like picking up some Tony Gwynns. There's one last one I am targeting. That'll be for a future video. I have to still acquire it yet. But yeah, and one more thing while we're going out here. Let's go ahead and put these right over here. Yeah, finish these up here. The last thing that I would mention, let's get that shine on there. Yeah. Is there's another guy who is in this night. Well, it's a couple guys really, but I'm thinking of another one, similar caliber of player, George Brett, much like Nolan Ryan. This is a playing days card for George Brett, and yet a PSA 9 can be had for about that same, $400, $400 or $500 tier as Gwynn. So, why does Nolan Ryan get this crazy bump in value and demand, where you have George Brett, who actually had a higher WAR total than Nolan Ryan, but just doesn't get the hobby love. And so, yeah, life's not fair. But I wanted to point that out because it had been something I'd been thinking about. And yeah, it was just on my mind and wanted to discuss that. So what do you guys think? To conclude here, is there anything that you would change drastically? Is there like a big Rickey Henderson collector out there who has a very strong feeling about where he should be included? Or like I was saying, if you are more of the vintage persuasion and you want to put this for the golden era, the 50s and 60s, who, Willie Mays versus Hank Aaron, where do they stack up? I'm curious to know. So what do you think about this? Is this something that you ever use in your collecting to help either determine value comps, decide what's a good price for selling, what's a good price for buying, what might be a good deal, and where there is value? Is this something that you do? Anyway, let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.